Welcome back. This is episode 18 from Willing Warriors. We called this one, we got a little tricky. We called it, used an alliteration, Bedtime Battles and Food Fights. So if you've had children of any age, you've already encountered this. So take heart, put away some excuses that were easily used. Be a willing warrior and take this head on. What do I mean? So here we are talking about, let's start first with food fights. Is there anything new under the sun? Scripture says no, there's nothing new under the sun. So here's what God has done. He's put Adam and Eve in the garden. He said, look at all this beautiful garden, these trees and plants. You can eat from all of these. It just wasn't one or two trees. Imagine hundreds, thousands of different kinds of varieties out there. You can eat from all of them, except that one. And that's where Satan got them, right? That's where Adam and Eve were tempted, and that's where they sinned. They had to eat from just the one. Forget the other 100. They wanted to eat from just that one. So our children are like us. They have a sinful nature, and they are going to make fights about food. They are going to want to exert their sinful foolishness and independence here. So take it up. Take up the battle. Remember, drive foolishness far from their heart, and stop providing yourself with any excuses. So maybe my dear wife will start with some tactics of how we took this battle up, maybe especially for the younger ones.
Okay, well, it probably goes without saying, but let's just start at ground zero. If a person has been snacking all morning, all afternoon, and you're not really all that hungry when you come to the dinner table, guess what? I don't want to eat, and they'll pick and, put their food apart. So I'm not saying, I think it is important, especially when children go through different growth spurts and stuff, that the metabolism changes and they might need a couple of extra snacks to keep that energy going and being fed. However, if we offer them multiple snacks between meals, they're not generally going to come to the meal table all that hungry. So therefore, that's almost like the first part. Now, I was always such a nice mom. I always gave my family two options when it came to mealtime, was take it or leave it. So I shouldn't say never. I rarely gave them an opportunity. I might occasionally give them a choice, especially like at lunch. Do you want peanut butter and jelly or peanut butter and honey or something like that? But I pretty much put my foot down and would not be a short order cook for every person in our household. I didn't have the time, the energy, or the desire to try to do that. But I did try to offer wholesome meals. Most of them were made from scratch or something thereof. And it was considered a luxury if we had something that was like, I don't know, hot dogs and macaroni and cheese or something. But anyway, so I guess we've covered this before too in previous episodes, is to develop a heart of thankfulness, of gratefulness. We're not necessarily owed anything, and some people have far less than what we were able to provide, and some people have far more, but to be content with where we're at and what we're offered. So I would encourage you to. Another common sense thing is if you have a 2-year-old that, eats 3 or 4 bites and then they're pretty much done, they might really be that. So if you put 3 big helpings on their plate and say you can't leave until you eat all that, that's not being very loving or reasonable either. But if they've picked or they've said, no, I don't want to eat that, or because we know they sort of want to get down and go play after family worship and they don't want to sit, oftentimes, not all the time, but we might offer a small dessert, a cookie or something. But if they've pretty much refused or just picked their food, we would just say, okay, well, we're going to cover it with saran, which we usually would do, put it in the refrigerator. When you're hungry, come back and eat this before you may have dessert. So anyway, we try to just be consistent. And so hopefully that was loving.
So the children would learn how the battle was waged. They would learn that they couldn't win it, and they would fall in line. And so what's the premises? We're driving foolishness far from their heart, and we're trying to teach them to be thankful. So let's come to Psalm 24:1. So this is a text that Paul uses talking to the Corinthians in reference to food. And here's what he says, or here's what David says in the Psalm. The earth is the Lord's and all its fullness, the world and all those who dwell there within. So God's created this world, and how has he done it? Wonderfully, beautifully. All the smells and tastes and textures. And so one of the things that we're trying to teach our children about food is they have to be thankful. So when you came to the table, an arch sin was, I don't like this is bad. And if they yell or if they were fussing and grumpy, this was not at all accepted. They were warned. If they continued on, they would be disciplined. The other thing we were trying to do with them is to get them to try everything. Yes, I know that texture was different. You'd never had an avocado before. You've never had this before, but try it. Now, if they tried everything, and we recognize not all children like onions or broccoli, okay, well, they tried it once and we know it. They don't have to try it again, but you have to try everything once because God has created these things and he's created them good. So we didn't want children to dictate the terms, and we didn't want children to be fearful. We wanted children to be thankful. And so this is what we tried to do. You might remember another from a proverb in Proverbs 15:17. Better is a dinner of herbs where there is love. So we wanted them to love our Creator, what he's made. We wanted them to love one another. They wanted them to love what mom had done. Than a fatted calf with hatred. We didn't want them and their sinfulness to spill over and dictate the terms of the meal. So take on those food fights. Take them on. Don't let those young children define the dinner hour. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about some other tactics we used.
Well, obviously, so I know I've covered before, I believe that I usually, especially when we were in the height of having a full house and busy homeschooling and all the things that go with that, toddlers and piles of mountains of laundry, I would try to organize my meals. So if it's just like, if you're on edge anyway, because you don't know what you're going to make, and we always had plan A, B, and C. If all else failed, make a breakfast dinner, scrambled eggs and pancakes or sausage or something. But I tried to have a mind, so very early on, the children would be like, oh, what are we having for dinner? So I tried to have something that they, for the most part, enjoy. But I will say, if you sat down, and sometimes I would say, oh, mom's trying to think of some meals for dinner. Give me some suggestions. What are your favorites? And they would just throw out some of them. Of course, if you ask most 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, oh, what would you like for dinner? I want cookies and Doritos and soda. And, so yeah, that's not going to happen. But that's not loving them in the biggest way. That might be what they would like, but it might not be the best for them. So, we have a couple, we have several grown children, but 1 or 2 of them really like different ethnic food. So they make Thai and Chinese, even Korean barbecue, different things that are spicy. And they realize maybe the children aren't quite up to all of that, but they tone it down a little bit. But like Kevin mentioned, just try some. And even if you don't really care for it, you say, this is not my favorite, instead of crossing their eyes and sticking their tongue out and saying, or, the gag reflex. So to show a heart of thankfulness, but just don't be afraid to try a variety of different things. I still have some that don't like cucumbers, and that's okay.
So some of those children have picked that up from their father. So the second battlefront that you'll face, quick note about food. So not only will there be a battle for children on food, there's other battles that we have on food. There's a whole group out there that are trying to promote salvation through diet, salvation through this is just the right diet, and you can't have this and you can't have that. So I applaud mothers, and if there's fathers involved as well, trying to give their children nutritious food. But remember, it's a great and honorable goal, but there's not salvation found through this, right? If there's any salvation food, it's the Lord's Supper. It's the bread and the wine that we take. The second battlefront that you'll face early on with children after bedtime or after food is the bedtime battles, right? The children want to show forth their foolishness. They want to decide when they go to bed, and they will fight you tooth and nail, screaming and yelling. They will declare war. Parents, you cannot buckle. If you buckle, they will take note, and they know I just have to push till mom and dad buckle. With prayerful resolve, take the battle on and do not buckle. Do not concede control, no matter how much they whine or cry or cajole. Be firm. When it's time to be firm, set the boundaries and stick to it. And don't buckle your knees. So, and it's important when we talk about bedtimes not to spring this kind of stuff on them, but to have set routines that the children can find themselves falling into. So maybe you can describe some of those routines, especially starting with the younger ones.
Well, obviously for infants, newborns, infants, even young toddlers, generally, of course, newborns, that's a whole different story, because their bodies are changing so much in their feeding times. And just when you get into a nice routine and you're sleeping through 3 hours through the night at a time, then all of a sudden the baby starts waking up every hour and a half. But that's with the newborn. So as they get a little bit older, even I would say in the infancy stage, a lot of times, there would be times I'd get up and nurse the baby and change the diaper and just had trouble. You can put a baby in bed, but you can't make them sleep. But we can develop good routines, and that gives them a sense of security, just a sense of expectancy of not putting them to bed, at 6:30 one night because mom needs some downtime, and 10:30 the next night, and but just within a half hour range, saying, okay, it's time to settle down. So you might give them a nice bath, or at least change their diaper, snuggle with them, sing a song, make sure they're fed, their tummies are full, and then lay them down, maybe pat them on the back if they take a pacifier. And sometimes they're asleep, but even when they aren't, to know that it's bedtime and to lay them down and good night. And then they might lay there for a while, but sometimes they might start crying. And so, you let them cry a little bit, go in and pat their back some and try again. And this is hard. I don't know any parent that has enjoyed that. And I know there are different philosophies, but I would say even at a young age to teach them, to enjoy rest and, I guess in a way, not help me out here,
not to expect to get their way.
Expect to get their way whenever they cry. But if it's especially before they talk, they're like, well, what else are they supposed to do? But, just to pat them and comfort them and pray for wisdom,
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about routine. So think about how God has created the world, right? 12 hours every day, there's darkness, there's light, darkness and light. He's created the world with that routine. And then he's created the world with different seasons and patterns. And so this is how we want to create our house in this way too. We want to have routines and patterns. And imagine if one day the sun didn't come up. Imagine one day the sun didn't set. How devastating this would be. So set those routines, stick to those routines, and help your children to enjoy them and appreciate them. Now, my wife talked about when they're young, setting routines and even letting them cry themselves to sleep, right? Not letting them dictate the day. We will dictate the day. So this this battles flare up again. Maybe you've got them wrestled down from 3, and then all of a sudden, again, it comes back up at 12, 13, 14. So the battles will pick up again, right? Especially when they know that their older sibling stays up later. Why can't I stay up later? So again, find that routine when they're older. And maybe look a little different, may have some similarities. We might end up reading a book, brushing their teeth. Make sure you get that drink. They get that drink before they go to bed, because if you don't, they will tell you. Again, sing a song with them, pray with them, kiss with them, tuck them in, whatever the routine is, do it and do it regularly. Kids really take to this well. And then give them the command. Do not get out of bed. I get if there's a fire alarm, they get out of bed, but for 99.9% of the other things, do not get out of that bed. If you've given them that command, and I think you should, then follow through with it. And if they get out of bed, they have sinned, they've broken fellowship with you and God. Set those clear boundaries and stick to them. Let them know that their foolishness is not going to rule the day. All this, what we're trying to do is we're trying to impart the greatest blessing to our children, letting our children stay up all hours of the night, not establishing routines. This is not a great blessing. God's established routines with us. We want to establish routines with our children. And so if they have broken fellowship and you want to know how to deal with that, look up episode number 11, when children break fellowship, of how we discipline them. There we discuss that. Maybe you want to talk a little about routines with the old routines with some of our other children.
Well, as Kevin mentioned, it's sort of like using textbooks. They serve a purpose, but that's not the all in all. And routine, if there's a point where we need to show grace to someone else or serve, we're not saying that has to be our master, but it is important to establish good routines, and it helps us to develop discipline, virtues that we want to embody in our spiritual life or just in our daily walk. So the older, Kevin mentioned, as they got older, their bedtimes usually were appropriately moved back. They all look forward to the day. They didn't have to go to bed until 10 o'clock. And then after they got to a certain age, like 16 or so, we just told them they could go to bed whenever they wanted, as long as they set their alarm according to the time that we used to get up and, maybe read a psalm together and have breakfast. We don't do that as our family's gotten smaller. We don't do that anymore, but we do get up and read scripture and have other routines. But we do encourage them to get up and be productive, not burn daylight, right? If they're getting up at 10, 10:30, 11, they're generally not ready to go to bed at 8, 9, 10. They want to get later and later. And then it just turns out to sort of be a vicious cycle where sleep routines are all messed up.
Yeah, so think about if you let your children set their own routines, what would they end up doing? They would sleep during the day and they would be up all night. And what does scripture say, right? It says the wicked man does his deeds in the dark, right? The sloth, what's he want to do? He wants to stay up all night. He wants to entertain himself. He wants to play video games. And when the sunlight comes around in the morning, he's like a door on a hinge. He's turning in his bed. And how many times you knock on the door, he's just rolling back and forth. And before you know it, it's lunchtime. So we are created, children, setting that routine, right? We're created to be people of the light. I'm not talking about people who work on a back shift, but generally we're created for people of the day. We're to be working 6 days. So if your children are having a hard time sleeping, even as they get older, right, you might also need them to do more work, right? So what we're all doing is we teach our children about eating and about sleeping. We're teaching them how to control their passions, their desires, their tastes, and how to get those to match up with God. So setting a bedtime is one of those first battles you'll have. So take it up and take it up well. Maybe a few words you can offer as we had kids of multiple ages in the same room and staggered bedtimes.
Yeah, that always presented an interesting, not necessarily a battle, but it just required a lot of effort and patience at times because you put the little ones to bed. Well, why isn't so-and-so going to bed? Well, they're older, and when you get older, and they thought that day would never come, but indeed it did. It was harder for them to settle down because they wanted to stay awake until their sister got in bed, made sure they were in bed on time. But then when you do have them, I know, especially I'm reminded of this when we have grandchildren that sometimes spend the night. I used to try to put them to bed at the same time in the same room and soon realized that just didn't work very well because then there was don't put your toes on me. Don't do this. And they weren't trying to be naughty or, it just escalated until then there was crying or they were coming out of the room. So, it just takes grace. It takes consistency. No, you need to go back in bed, and stay there, and so will be in bed soon. So, God, when he created the world, created it in an orderly way. You can look at almost anything in nature, the dandelion, in the perfect symmetry of all the little seeds there. And so much, it's just order. And we are to exemplify him because this is beautiful. So we don't want a household that's just full of chaos and the children are trying to run the show, but they don't maybe really know. They just want their way, and maybe that's not your way. So lovingly set boundaries and be willing to, as much as depends on you, or the ability to be consistent in that. And that is loving.
Yeah. So let me throw you for a loop. So we've been talking about young children, and now maybe kids in their 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Now I want to talk about kids that are coming into adulthood, believe it or not. When they hit adulthood, we said, there's no bedtime for you. You might look at me, what were you thinking? Well, we're trying to prepare them for adulthood. Our emphasis then went from a bedtime to a getting up time. And so we were trying to give them adult lessons and show them the adult consequences, because they were going to move out of the house one day. They were going to go off to college. They were going to get their own place. What they had to learn is mom and dad aren't going to call you, are you in bed? We weren't going to oversee that. But they were likely going to have a job. And guess what the employer expected? He expected them to come to work in the morning. So we wanted our children to learn. If you wanted to stay up all night and do all kinds of stuff, you still had to get up at whatever our wake-up time was, 7 in the morning. And if you got 4 hours of sleep, well, guess what? You were going to suffer that day. And we hoped you learned the lesson. So teach your children these things, right? Teach them, let them learn some of the lessons. Let them have small screw-ups. Let them understand the consequences of their actions, or that their actions do have consequences. Let them learn themselves. Train them for adulthood. And so we just switch the battle from that. Let them do some small, stupid things. Not sinful things, but small, stupid things. And hopefully they will learn getting 4 hours of sleep and watching 6 hours of Lord of the Rings movies. I think wasn't a good idea when I had to get up at 7 in the morning. So parents, bless your children. Sometimes the greatest blessings you give to them is telling them no. Sometimes it's spanking them. Sometimes it's letting them cry themselves to sleep, driving foolishness far from their heart. So take up these battles of bedtimes, take up these battles of food fights, and do it all for the glory of God. Maybe you want to close us out?
Well, parents, be willing warriors, and that often requires sacrifice of your time, sometimes of your energy, sometimes sleep. But be willing warriors and take up these battles and drive this foolishness from your child's heart, and know that is done in love. Until next time.